Hello, students. This video lecture is going to introduce you to human genetics. And really, meiosis explains a lot of what we understand about human genetics. The information on genetics is really going to be coming from lab and class. So I have here meiosis explains human genetics. Lab book, page 109, gives you a lot of background in that lab. And then some textbook like page 183. But you're going to have to really look at and understand what we do in lab on our genetics days. And your guided notes, a lot of this eventually will come out as problems. All right, so let's review that meiosis produces gametes, egg and sperm, and those gametes really only have one of the homologous pairs of chromosomes in each gamete. And when the gamete, the egg and sperm fuse during fertilization, they produce what we call as the zygote. The egg and sperm fuse into one cell, and that produces a zygote that reestablishes a homologous pair for all the chromosomes, right? Because the egg had half, the sperm had half, they fuse, and now it's a diploid zygote that has 2 copies of every chromosome. All right. So I'm just explaining it in this visual. The sperm, let's say, and we're going to now in genetics be focusing on one gene, but realize that we as people have millions of genes, right? But when we talk about genetics, we're just focusing on one of those in one of the pair of chromosomes, right? Okay, so in this example, I'm showing you the sperm in one, right? It only has one of each homologous pair. So I'm showing you one chromosome of a pair. There is the gene for the pigment of eye color. This is just a hypothetical example. And let's say that this sperm had the gene that codes for brown. All right, so that brown is a form of the eye color gene. So we refer to that as an allele. Allele is a form of a gene. So genes can come in all different forms. For human genetics, we're typically going to be saying they come in one of 2 forms, but in actuality, sometimes it's more than that. And so this sperm has the allele for eye color brown. The egg that it's going to fuse with during fertilization has the other homologous chromosome that eventually they'll reunite and find each other, but that chromosome has the allele for blue. So when the egg and sperm fuse, they make the zygote, that zygote divides, and from that point on, all the cells are genetically identical. Those 2 single chromosomes reunite to make a homologous pair. One of the chromosomes had the brown-eyed allele, the other one had the blue-eyed, but that child comes out as having brown eyes, right? And so we're going to talk about that. Like some genes are masked by others. So even though this individual down here, let me get my pointer, even though this individual had inherited the brown-eyed allele from the sperm of the father and the blue-eyed allele from the egg of the mother, they came out as brown eyes because this blue-eyed allele kind of gets masked. And you can kind of see that. We're going to call that dominant and recessive, but you can see if you mix brown with a little blue, the brown is going to mask the blue. Okay, so allele, we already said, is a form of a gene. Examples are brown or blue, and we generally give it a single letter designation. So we're talking about one trait, eye color. So it's got to be the same letter. We're going to make the dominant one, the one that masks the other one, capital. So in this case, big B. And the other one, recessive, the one that gets overpowered, let's say, lowercase, little b. So the dominant, the presence of only one dominant gene makes the individual have the trait. So in the example I gave you before, the child ended up with two genes because the homologous chromosomes paired up. Brown from the mom, dad, blue from the mom. But the presence of the brown made the individual have that brown trait. So that's the dominant one. You would need to have both of the genes of the recessive trait to exhibit, to show that trait. So the only way you can have blue eyes, and actually now they've modified this a little bit, is if you inherited the recessive blue-eyed trait gene from each parent. And that one is noted by a lowercase. So this is the example, right? How could this individual be blue-eyed if they would have inherited the blue-eyed allele from both? And the individual, everyone has 2 copies of the gene. So for every gene or every trait that you exhibit, that you have, you actually carry 2 genes, 2 copies of it, because we are diploid organisms, because we have homologous chromosomes. So any trait in our body, we exhibit 2. So when we talk about genetics, for every trait of an individual, we're usually going to give it a 2-letter combination because each letter represents 1 gene, and we have 2 genes for every trait. But for the gametes, the egg or sperm, they're only going to have 1 letter. Okay, now we're going to introduce a few more terms. We've talked about allele, which is the form that the trait can come in, the form of the gene. Different genes can come in all sorts of forms. So for the trait eye color, right, it can be blue, brown, hazel. Those are alleles, forms of the gene. We talked about dominant versus recessive. The dominant one masks the presence of the recessive gene, kind of hides it. To have a recessive physical trait, you would have to have both genes have the recessive allele. And now we're going to introduce some more terms. The first is the genotype versus the phenotype. So when we talk about genotype, think about what is the actual 2 gene combination that organism has. Because every organism, or every human, has 2 copies of a gene for every trait. Those genes can be in different forms, but for every trait, eye color, dimples, hair texture, height, number of fingers, we're going to talk about that. It's 2 genes for every trait. You inherited 1 from your mom, 1 from your dad. So remember that. And so we designate those 2 genes. We give them a code by letters. So genotype refers to the 2 gene combination that we put down as 2 letters. The letters represent the genes and that the alleles that they come in. So for example, the example we just gave before about the eye color, you could have a genotype of big B, which means you inherited both brown-eyed alleles from each parent, right? Each parent gave you brown allele, and so your genotype, your 2 gene combination is big B. If you inherited, like in our example, a brown eye allele from your father and a blue eye from your mother, your genotype would be big B, little b. If you inherit both blue eye alleles from each parent, you'd be little b. So genotype refers to the 2 gene combination. And notice there were 3 possibilities. Now the phenotype refers to what does that genotype produce physically about your appearance. So think phenotype, physical appearance. And so unlike the genotype that we had 3 possibilities, with the phenotype we only have 2. Because both big B and big B, little b would produce a brown-eyed phenotype, physical characteristic. And only little b would produce a blue-eyed physical characteristic. Homozygous refers to when the genotype is the same. Homo means same. So big B or little b would be homozygous. Heterozygous is when the 2 gene combination is different. Big B, little b. Okay, so this is just a little more examples here. So gametes combine to reform homologous pairs and result in our physical appearance, right? So now we're looking at a different gene. We're looking at the gene for skin pigmentation, right? This is probably on a different chromosome than the eye color one. Remember, we have thousands of different genes. But again, each of these genes has 2 copies. Gametes only have 1 copy of each. Fertilization makes the zygote that reforms that. So look at these pictures. So now we're looking at skin pigmentation. Okay, normal versus albino. And so the sperm has 1 gene for skin pigmentation. The egg has 1 gene. So in the first example, the sperm is giving, and generally they're giving you a key here. So we're talking about skin pigmentation. So that's 1 trait. So we want to give the same, designate the 2 alleles, the 2 forms with the same letter. The dominant one will be capital. The recessive one will be lowercase. So alleles means forms of the gene. What gene are we talking about? Skin pigmentation. Capital A means normal. That's the dominant. Little a means recessive, and that's the albino, lack of pigmentation. So in this first example, both the sperm and the egg carry the normal dominant pigmentation. When they fuse, here is the zygote. Now we have 2 copies of the gene, and every cell from that point on will have 2 copies, so that individual will be normal. So the genotype would be big A, the phenotype would be normal pigmentation. In the middle example, both the egg and the sperm are carrying a recessive lack of pigmentation allele for the skin pigmentation. The zygote would have the genotype would be little a, and we could also describe this as a homozygous condition because they're both the same. And that zygote would produce an individual that all their cells have recessive lack of pigmentation, both gene copies, and so that individual would be physically, the phenotype would be albino. And in the third combination, the sperm has the recessive lack of pigmentation allele, the egg has the dominant normal pigmentation, so when they fertilize and make the zygote, they have this heterozygous big A, little a genotype, but phenotypically, that would be normal pigmentation. So another example, and we're going to talk about this in lab as well, is what's called the length of the fingers. So notice the hand on the right has short fingers, which that's actually a dominant trait. So you could have short fingers by having the genotype big S or big S little s. How do I know this? Well, we just randomly picked S to designate finger length trait. And we know that short is dominant, so we designate that a big S. The individual will always have 2 copies of the gene for finger length because it's a gene and we have 2 copies for all our genes. So we could either be big S or big S little s. Long fingers, there's only 1 genotypic option because that's a recessive trait. So the genotype would be little s. Freckles is another one that works this way. Freckles, right, is actually, this is, usually people think the dominant one is more common. That's not always the case. So freckles is an example where, look at freckles, big F or big F little f. So freckles in this case is dominant. And no freckles, little f is the recessive. So here's a question to see if you understand this. If neither parent has freckles, okay, what's the only genotypic possibility to not have freckles? No freckles is little f. So if neither parent has freckles, what's the chance of having a child with freckles? Well, if the parent is little f, meiosis produces their gametes that splits these homologous genes apart. But the only possibility for the female's egg or the male sperm would be a little f, which means fertilization, the only possibility for the child is little f. So there'd be no chance of having a child with freckles. What if the father is homozygous dominant man? Okay, so I'm making you use the terms. If the father is a homozygous dominant man and the wife has no freckles. So this is the man, homozygous dominant, and the woman has no, so she only possible this. Then what are their children going to be? Well, the only thing that the man's sperm can have is a big F. The only thing the female egg can have is a little f. So all the children will be heterozygous big F, little f, which means all the children will have freckles. Okay, I'm going to end there for this video, and we'll talk about Punnett squares in our next one.